Chapter 13 Zanzibar Feast. For the last few weeks, John and I had been making our plans for the projected voyage to Australia. I had taken down and stripped Uhuru's engine, and it was running as sweetly as a man could wish. I was now tackling all the brass work, which was in the process of going green, and had started to apply a kind of varnish, which the manufacturers swore would prevent the brass tarnishing no matter what climate we sailed to. Happening to look shorewards, I saw John approaching in the dinghy, and, always glad of an excuse to stop work, I went aft to catch the painter. As soon as he was aboard, he said, "Come below and look at this." This was one of those lovely ancient maps our ancestors doted on. It depicted the Sea of Zanj, and showed a large expanse of water dotted with islands of various sizes, all with names I had never heard of. If it came to that, I had never heard of the Sea of Zanj either. The west side of the map showed an outline of what was obviously supposed to be the east coast of Africa. It covered an area roughly between the Tropic of Capricorn and the equator, and the whole map was dotted with ships and whales, and the islands had weird and wonderful animals roaming about on them. And not only animals, one large island, presumably Madagascar, sported a huge bird carrying off an elephant in its talons. It was a map to delight the heart. "That's where our old pal Sinbad the sailor roamed about," said John. "Remember the Roc and all our other feathered friends." I was fascinated by this map. Obviously it represented what is known as the Indian Ocean, and I started to identify the various islands. There they all were, or at least most of them: Mauritius, Rodriguez, Reunion, Madagascar, Aldabra, Comoro, Providence, Amarant, Zanzibar, Seychelles, and quite a few that simply don't exist. Nearly all these islands are in actual fact groups of islands, as for instance the Seychelles, which is a group of nearly 100, some quite large, and Madagascar, which has a swarm of small islands in the vicinity. But these were never shown on the map. I pitied any poor sailor who relied upon this kind of map to make his landfall. "Thought it would interest you," John said, "and when you've got time, have a browse through these books." And he indicated a pile of books he had dumped on the floor. I hastily looked at the titles. There was Islands in a Forgotten Sea by T.V. Bulpin, a book I heartily recommend to anyone. History of Madagascar by S. Copland. Hongria the Pirate, this last published in 1737, and half a dozen others. I'm afraid that work went by the board for the next few days. I couldn't tear myself away from the accounts of these old-time adventurers. It does not seem to be generally realized that the Indian Ocean was much more of a pirate's lair than was the Spanish Main and the South Sea Islands. On this sea sailed the famed Indian merchantmen, carrying all the treasures of the East, and until the Suez Canal was opened, all shipping had to sail round the Cape of Good Hope to reach India and the Chinese ports. Pirates simply abounded, and no ships, even those of the Royal Navy, were safe from them. Literally, hundreds of ships were wrecked upon the isles and atolls of this sea, many of them carrying vast treasures. Some of the fiercest typhoons range over this sea, and these contributed to wrecks in no small measure. Added to the dangers of storms, the place was hardly charted at all, and where it was, positions were given miles out of their actual situation. It is no wonder that so many ships met with disaster, and only surprising that so many managed to avoid all the hazards and complete their voyages. During the next week or so, John and I read every book we could get that dealt with the Sea of Zanj. We were both fascinated with the islands and their history. The long and the short of it was that we both agreed that we should first do a trip all round the islands before setting off on the long haul to Australia. The Seychelles we had done pretty thoroughly, so we decided to do the trip anti-clockwise, starting at Zanzibar, if we were allowed to land and explore, and going on to the Aldabras, Comoros, Madagascar, then sailing east to Reunion, Mauritius, Rodriguez, and then cutting up north to the Farquhars, Galapagos, Providence, Amarants, and so back to Mombasa. We had decided to go anti-clockwise because at the outset we should have the advantage of the northeast monsoon, and by the time we were on the return trip, we should have the advantage of the change to the southeast monsoon, which would blow us along in a desired direction. We should also, with luck, miss the typhoon season. We had no wish to join the many proud ships that foundered in these fair-seeming waters. Naturally, we did not fail to read also modern books and gather up-to-date information about the islands. Many of the smaller ones still seem to be very sparsely inhabited, and many atolls were classed as only seasonally inhabited, which probably meant they were visited occasionally by guano or egg collectors. We hoped to find many as they were in the 16th century. Also there were all those treasure ships lying about all over the place, to say nothing about kingly graves full of silver and dining room tables, although we assured each other that we were certainly not going on a treasure hunt. At the back of our minds, we both hoped to come across a nice ship of the Grand Moguls, with a few chests of gold pieces, asking to be picked up. I don't know why it is. We certainly didn't need the money. But there is something fascinating and alluring about buried treasure and wrecked galleons that is almost irresistible. We both agreed that any wreck we might possibly come across would be so covered in coral or sand and generally broken up that it would be useless to try and salvage anything. Nevertheless, on the pretext of exploring the coral reefs, we bought a couple of aqua lungs and practiced in the shallow lagoons of Mombasa. We had both done a lot of goggle diving, but of course we could go much deeper with the lungs. We were warned to rest in stages when we came up, otherwise we might get the bends. However, we never went to any depth around Mombasa. Meanwhile, we had a couple of months to wait till we reached the season of favorable winds. But there is always something to do on a boat, some repair or improvement to make. We decided to install a better echo sounder and a more powerful wireless transmitter, and I fell for a new Delco charging set, which would enable us to have a really powerful searchlight. Very useful at night when you are amongst a lot of reefs and atolls and not too sure of your exact position. Then happened something that was to change all our plans, or rather defer them, for we are now again planning to explore this Sea of Zanj. We had been to a good many parties and sundowners, and had met the same chap at several of them. We had not paid him much attention. He was just one of those chaps one does meet at parties. We were rather surprised, therefore, when one morning he came aboard and asked if he might put a proposition before us which he thought might interest us. First confirming that we were not planning to sail for another couple of months, he got down to brass tacks. He said that he represented an organization, the name of which he later told us, and which I hasten to add was connected with neither the United Kingdom nor the United States, which was interested in discovering whether certain countries were assisting in the transit of arms of communist origin to the rebels in the Congo. He knew, he added, quite a bit about us, and wanted to know whether we would be prepared to help. All the expenses and no question of the amount would be paid. Look, boys, he went on, what we are after is absolutely correct, and up-to-the-minute information as to what is going on in Zanzibar and Tanganyika. Now this will be no cakewalk. I doubt if you will be able to get visas for Zanzibar, and that will mean that you'll probably have to get ashore illegally. You know what that means. You may be slung in jail, fined, though of course we would pay that, or bump into some trigger-happy thug. I shall quite understand if you turn it down. Personally, I was rather inclined to do so. Recently, an Englishman in the employ of the Zanzibar government had returned from leave. He arrived back in Zanzibar in his own yacht, which he had purchased, to be told on arrival that his job was no longer there. What was more, they seized his house and the yacht and booted him out, only allowing him to take out 20 quid. This was typical of them, and I had no wish to lose a hooroo. John suggested that we might think it over rather carefully and let him have our decision in the morning. That night, sitting on a hooroo's deck, we argued the pros and cons. I felt that if I backed out, I was being a bit of a coward. John felt much the same. By midnight, we had not come to any decision, one way or the other. We decided to sleep on it. Next morning, we went over the same old arguments, and at last I said, let the fates decide. Heads we go, tails we don't. I tossed a shilling. It came down heads. John pushed off to let the organization know our decision. and I stayed aboard to get Uhuru ready for the trip. There was really not much to do. We were well provisioned, and it was really only a matter of checking things, generally, and getting fresh water. John returned about midday, grinning all over his face, with a nice fat check in his pocket. Actually gave me more than we asked for. Said we might want some ready cash. Come in handy for bribes, fines, and what-nots. We reckoned we should be ready to sail in a couple of days' time. There are always a lot of odds and ends to get before a trip, even a short one like this, and it was not till Saturday morning that we managed to get away. Oh, the joy of being once more at sea! Even Buller was panting with excitement, and already on the lookout for flying fish. The poor old chap had been miserable when we went away, and had not eaten his food for a couple of days. I promised him I would not leave him again. Once well clear of the harbor, we set the sails and cut the engine. There was almost a dead-head wind, and we knew we should have to contend with this all the way if the trades ran true to form. However, it would blow us back in record time on the return trip. Even Uhuru seemed to be glad to be away from land again, sticking her nose in the short, choppy seas. One always gets nearer land in these latitudes. She started her old trick of flipping a dollop of spray into the cockpit, much to John's annoyance, he being at the helm. We had decided to make long tacks, and it was 2 hours before we put about on the other tack. John took a bearing, and to our disappointment we found that we had only gained 3 miles southing. Actually, time didn't matter to us much, but we had been doing 5 knots, and had imagined we had made more mileage than this. Of course, we had the current against us as well as the wind, so I suppose that really we had not done so badly. We had not agreed on any washes, but after 4 hours John suggested that I take over whilst he cooked some lunch. I wasn't too keen on this. He is not exactly a cordon bleu, but unfortunately rather fancied himself as an inventor of dishes. As long as he sticks to plain stuff, I have no complaints, but I hadn't forgotten the oyster pie he made on one occasion. The pastry was up to standard, and so were the tinned oysters. I agreed with him that one has a little lemon juice with oysters, but to pour a glass full of neat lime juice, plus some tomatoes to buck the flavor up a bit, and Worcestershire sauce as an encore, to say nothing of a generous dose of pepper, was not my idea of an oyster pie. However, this time he produced a lovely plateful of ham and eggs with fried bread, but couldn't resist putting it all on a couple of slices of pineapple. After lunch we both lolled in the cockpit and yarned. It was fine to be at sea with old John again. Our talk turned naturally to our coming trip round the islands in the Sea of Zange. We should have to time it carefully if we were to escape the typhoon season, and make certain that we were able to harbor in some safe place. This would not be too easy, as there didn't seem to be many really good harbors available. We could always run back to Mombasa, But our idea was to go south, perhaps to Cape Town, when we had finished exploring the islands, thence to follow the old Indian route to India, and then on to Australia. But we had to finish this job first. I had an idea as to how we were to do this. I figured that the best thing to do would be to sail innocently into Zanzibar harbor, under the pretext that I needed some spare or other for the engine. We might get a chance to have a look round, or, on the other hand, we might not. Anything could happen. We might get our boat confiscated, get heavily fined, or even chucked into prison. If by any chance we found that this idea was no good, I thought a good idea would be to sail right round the southern end, and up the east coast, till we came to old Shillingy's village. Naturally we wouldn't just barge in. My idea was to catch him when he was well out fishing, and see how the land lay. I put these ideas to John, and after we had mulled them around, we could come up with nothing better. About dusk, the wind dropped to a light breeze, and I doubted if we were holding our own against the current, let alone making any headway. This was annoying. With no wind to speak of, and a 4-mile current against us, we might very well end up where we had started in fact, unless the wind came back. That is exactly what would happen. Although it went against the grain, I decided to proceed on engine, and revved her up until we were doing 6 knots. At that rate, we should be gaining a couple of miles an hour during the night. Not very satisfactory, but better than nothing. According to the log, at 5 o'clock, the wind returned, and I had no compunction about calling John to get the sails up. Chugging along on the engine is, for me at any rate, far from restful. I am continually listening to the engine, waiting for a misfire, or some small noise that shouldn't be there. Under sail and a fair wind, you can blissfully dream your watch away. Just as a faint light began to show in the east, we spotted a huge aircraft carrier coming up on the port side. She was too far off to identify, but we thought she was British. She overhauled us in no time at all, and certainly had a bone in her teeth. I think I'll send her a message, I said, and rushed below and got the Aldous lamp. I remembered very vividly the other occasion I had spoken to an unknown ship, and decided to repeat my previous question. "Do you want a tow?" I signaled. There was no reply. She sailed serenely on. I was not going to be ignored like this. I repeated my message. No reply. She continued on her steady course, when suddenly, from what must have been some porthole near the water line, a very rude word indeed was flashed out. She was British all right, and I hope that the ratting who sent it, by what was, no doubt, his own private torch, was not spotted from the bridge. No sooner was she hull down than our friend the Kenya Castle passed us to the starboard, closely followed by a Robin Line cargo boat. We were certainly in the shipping lane. There is always a lot of traffic up and down the east coast, and it behooves a small boat to keep a good lookout. The thought of being run down is always a nightmare to yachtsmen, and it happens more frequently than one would think, especially to those who have no engine to help them get out of the way quickly. In theory, of course, steam must give way to sail, but with a high sea running, it is not always easy to spot a small boat, particularly if its lights are not too good. We sighted the northern tip of Zanzibar on the 11th day, and the tricky part was upon us. We intended to sail into harbor on the excuse we wanted spares for the engine, when we would see how the land lay, and if possible have a general smooch round. We reckoned that it was even chances, that if they objected, the most they would do would be to order us to sheer off, though I reckoned that the odds would be a trifle in our favor. We ambled down the channel, and at 4 put up our flags about 2 miles from port, and slowed down to about a knot. I was at the helm, and had passed a dhow about a quarter of a mile back, and had taken no further notice of her. I was waiting for the pilot and doctor to come out, when suddenly I heard yells, and looking to port, saw the dhow apparently about to ram us. I swung the wheel right over, but with the little way we had on us, it didn't make any difference. However, that little was enough. I don't know to this day how she missed us, but miss us she did. John, who was up in the bows, taking a sly photo of the port, managed to get a good picture of her just as she passed. Neither can I understand why she came so close, unless it was a deliberate attempt to ram us, though why she should do this is beyond me. By the time we had exhausted our not inconsiderable flow of expletives, she had drawn away, and we saw the customs launch approaching, a huge flag of Tanganyika, or I suppose it was now Tanzania, at her masthead. They came alongside without scraping all our paint off, and 4 officials came aboard, 3 Africans and a European. The European was so Russian that I was surprised that there was no snow on his shoes. To my surprise, he advanced with a smile and said, "Captain." I nodded. Immediately he thrust out his hand, and we shook hands like old friends, his face all the time beaming with friendliness. "Port Authority," he said. "You have permit to land." "Zanzibar." "No, no permit." "No permit? Why is it you come to this country?" "I want a spare part for my engine." "If you have no permit, you cannot land. Under international law, a vessel needing repairs is allowed into any port to effect the repairs, and I intend to land and get the spare part I need." "Good, good, that is fine. I now inspect your papers." John, I, and our still smiling friend went below, leaving the 3 Africans on deck. They all had automatics strapped round their waist, and I never did discover their function unless it was to scowl and look as threatening as possible in order to discourage visitors. Once below, he hardly glanced at our papers. In fact, it seemed to me that possibly he couldn't read, though I may be maligning him. He put the papers on the chart table and stood there smiling. We had taken the precaution of bringing a few bottles of vodka with us, and this seemed a good time to put his apparent friendliness to the test. "Would you care for a drink of your national beverage, vodka?" I asked him. His smile grew broader than ever. "Vodka? Yes, very good, vodka. At home I drink much vodka." John handed him the bottle after opening it, and he poured himself out a generous half-tumbler. We had a modest tot. If I'd had a half-tumbler, I'd have been flat on my back. He raised the glass to his mouth, and was just about to drink it, when he checked himself and said, "The English say cheers." We nodded, and all three said cheers. He was just about to again drink, when he stopped once more. "I kill many Germans in Russia," he said, smiling happily at the thought. Then he downed the whole lot, in one go, without swallowing as far as I could see. "Now," he said, "I take you into port." At this moment Buller chose to sally forth from the sail locker, where he had been having a nap. I grabbed him quickly, as he is liable to take exception to strangers coming aboard. As soon as Smiler, as we christened him, saw Buller, he rushed forward, knelt down, and started to pat and caress him. "English bulldog," he kept on saying, and to my disgust, Buller lapped it up. The two might have been lifelong friends. After about 5 minutes of this sickening display on Buller's part, I suggested that we set about finding a berth. Smiler looked longingly at the bottle, and John passed it over. I wondered whether this time he would come out with a surprising remark, and he did not fail me. As before, just as he was about to drink, he stopped and said, "I buy the dog." I intimated that Buller was not for sale. Downing his drink in one go, he said, "I get the permit, come," and stamped up to the deck. He piloted us round to the yacht club berthing, near the old berth we had had when we were there during the Revolution, his armed gang following in the pilot boat. "Do not come ashore yet. I return, I get the permit." So saying, he jumped into the launch and departed. We thought this a pretty rum go. We had expected at least to be made to fill in hundreds of forms, and to be questioned at length. Still, we hadn't got the permit yet, and despite Smiler's assurance, I had some doubts. Meantime, I took a link out of the charging plant chain, so that I could have an excuse to wander about trying to get a spare one. No one came near us until after we had had lunch, when a very different individual came aboard. This chap certainly was no Smiler. He came accompanied by 2 Africans, who, he explained, would remain on board until such times as we departed. They were to guard the boat, but in fact it was obvious that they were to guard us, and see that we didn't step out of line. There was nothing we could do about that. Then came endless questions. Where had we come from? Where were we going? Why had we come? When did the engine break down? What part had broken? What was our nationality? Where were our passports? Why had we no visas for Zanzibar? Why did I live in Kenya if I was not a citizen, but had British nationality? What was my occupation? How much money had we? Were we carrying arms? why did we want to go to the island of Madagascar. I had told him that that was where we were bound, and 100 other questions. He left at last, warning us that we were not to go ashore. "Nice chap," John remarked. "What are we going to do about those 2 birds on deck?" I said that there didn't seem much we could do about it, but it wouldn't be much trouble to chuck them overboard if we wanted to get out in a hurry, or perhaps slip out at night, as we had done once before, when we took those women off. By 7 that evening nothing had happened, no permit had come, and no one had come near us. We decided to have a meal. I remained on deck whilst John went below to cook the last of our 2 steaks. Soon the lovely smell of frying steak and chips was wafted above, and I hurried below to check my portion. We had a rule that the cook had first whack at anything like steaks, where one portion might be bigger than the other, of which the cook of the day took full advantage, and it was as well to be there when dinner was served. We had hardly started when one of the Africans came below and stated he was hungry. I replied that I too was hungry and intended to have a good meal. He asked where their food was, to which I replied that this was no concern of mine, and further, neither of them had permission to come below, and that they were to stay on deck. As far as I was concerned, they could starve to death. After dinner, we read and talked until 10 or so, but then, as there was no sign of anyone coming near us, we decided one would stand watch and the other turn in for a while. I drew first watch of 2 hours, and went on deck to pass the time with Buller, who had by now accepted the 2 guards as part of the crew, although he kept a wary eye upon them. Almost as soon as I was on deck, they approached me and said that one would have to go ashore to get food, and demanded the dinghy. I pointed out that I certainly could not row them ashore, as I had no permit to land, and naturally I wouldn't let 2 strangers go off in my dinghy. I had no objection to them swimming for it, but I was neither going to feed or assist them in any way. When John relieved me, he concurred wholeheartedly in my attitude, and the 2 spent a miserable and hungry night. By midday next day, we were still waiting for someone on shore to contact us, and our 2 guards were fed up to the teeth with the starvation treatment, so much so that one of them hailed a passing canoe and went ashore in it. He must have contacted our questioner, because shortly after he came out and climbed aboard. His first question was why had we not given the guards food, to which I replied that if he left guards aboard, it was his job to see that they were fed, not mine. I had taken a violent dislike to this character, and certainly wasn't going to stand much more of him. John said, "Have you brought the permit to land?" "The permit has been refused, and you must await permissions to leave." This was too much for John. "Your permission to leave," he shouted. "This is a British ship, and neither you nor anyone else has authority to stop us. You have contravened international law by refusing us permission to effect repairs, which will be reported in the right quarters, and now we are sailing, with or without your permission, and you can get to hell off this boat and take your bloody guard with you." Now John is well over 6 feet, and quite a hunk of man, and when he gets angry, which is seldom, he is rather a frightening person. He advanced upon the Russian and again told him to get off the boat. Rather to my surprise, he called the guard and went over the side. When he was safely in his cutter, he shouted, "You have not permission to leave." I regret to say that I made a rude gesture. "Come on, Ricky, let's beat it before they call out the Navy." I dashed and started the engine, and we eased up to the buoy, and in no time at all had cast off. We went astern to get sea room. I kept casting rather an anxious eye ashore, half expecting to get a burst from some gun or other, but nothing happened. John swung her round, and we headed out to sea. It was one of the many times I was to bless an engine that started up without the slightest trouble. Even when we were a few miles out, I was still apprehensive, thinking it quite on the cards that we would be chased and made to return. I am of the opinion that they were so surprised at the swiftness of our departure that they had no time to get things going to stop us. Doubtless forms had to be filled in and permission got from half a dozen people before orders could be issued for our apprehension. Be that as it may, we saw no signs of pursuit, and held a steady course south. We kept in mid-channel till we reached the southern tip of the island. I didn't want to get too near Dar es Salaam. They might have wirelessed over above us, and as soon as we had reached the island's extremity, altered course and headed due east. It was quite dark by then, and we both felt much relieved. We had been rather apprehensive lest they had sent a boat after us. Neither of us knew whether we had contravened any maritime law by buzzing off at a moment's notice, without checking with authority. Probably we had. We had, of course, decided on our plan of campaign in the event of our not being allowed to land at the port. Our plan was this. The only contact we had on the island was my old Shillingy-Mingy, and I felt confident that if I could get in touch with him, he could smuggle me ashore, and I would have a chance to look round. I knew that, like all fishermen, he would set out at dawn for his fishing grounds, and return in the evening to his village. The idea was to fall in with him at sea, and ascertain whether he would be agreeable to the plan. I thought that a nice present of a few 100 shillings would tempt him. At any rate, it was the best plan I could think of, and it was worth a try. We thought that the best thing to do was to sail about well out to sea for a day or so to give the authorities a chance to forget all about us, or at any rate to assume that we had continued our voyage south. All that night and the next day we held a steady course east, and in the evening altered course north, sailing parallel to the coast, so as to be opposite the northern end of the island when we turned west. In other words, to sail 3 sides of a square. We now had the wind almost dead astern, and were making 6 knots with all sails set, and in addition we were being helped by the current. It was going to be rather tricky navigation, as we did not want to be spotted sailing up the coast by some sharp-eyed lookout or sentry, but hoped to strike Shilingi's village, right on the nose. It was situated 3 or 4 miles from the northern tip, and it was odds on that some sort of lookout would be at the extremity. Our problem was to arrive at the appropriate spot at dawn, when we had the best chance of contacting Shilingi at sea, without being spotted from the shore. This was not going to be easy, but John, who was doing the navigating, thought he could manage it. As usual, the wind faded to a light breeze as soon as it was dark, and we dropped down to a couple of knots. This suited us well if we were to time our arrival correctly. Actually, a day or so did not matter too much. If we found that we arrived too early, we could always hang about till dawn, keeping well over the horizon, and if too late, sheer off to the following day. As it happened, John turned up trumps, and we made it the first go. At about 4 o'clock on the 4th morning, John called me on deck and pointed out some lights to port. We were now off the coast, but not quite sure how far from the tip of the island. According to John's reckoning, another hour and a half should see us there. We decided to hold our course till it was light enough to identify some landmark. I thought it wise to switch over to engine, as we should then not be so conspicuous from the shore when it grew light. It didn't take long to stow the sails, and there was still time for a meal before dawn. I always believe in keeping the inner man well stoked, on the principle that you can't be dead sure when you will get another meal. Both Buller and John agree with me. We sheered off a bit so that we could sail straight in for land as soon as it got light enough to make sure we were in the right position. Needless to say, we were not showing any lights, and this necessitated keeping a weary eye open for any shipping that might be about. However, there was nothing. At about 6, we were able to make out the coastline, and found to our great relief that we were exactly where we wanted to be, dead opposite the village. I slowed her down until we were just about holding our position against the current, and John shinnied up the mast to see whether he could spot any fishing canoes coming off. After about a quarter of an hour, he shouted out that he could see 5, and they seemed to be heading straight out in our direction. I knew that they would not start fishing until they were about 5 miles offshore, when they would split up and spread out, with about a half-mile between each boat. I only hoped that Shilingi was in one of them. If he was, as head man, it would be he who would come up to investigate us. I promised Buller an extra bar of chocolate if our luck was in. It would take them quite a time to reach us, so I decided to risk going closer in, and sailed in to meet them. If they were not from Shilingi's place, we could sheer off and return the next morning. With the throttle wide open, we closed them pretty quickly. When it was obvious to them that we were heading for them, they all drew together and waited for us. As soon as we were within hailing distance, I yelled out, "Wapi Rafiki Yongo Shilingi Mingi. Where is my friend Shilingi Mingi?" And to my great relief, he shouted out, in Swahili, "Here I am, Bwana." Now I know it is you. This is very good indeed. I knew it was your boat, but I was frightened that it was not you. I now come aboard at once and pilot you in." In no time at all he maneuvered his boat alongside and came up over the rail. Naturally there were handshakes and the usual Swahili greetings. I quickly told him that we did not want to go ashore now, but that I should like him to stay aboard a little, as I had something I wanted to talk about, and suggested that he told his crew to carry on fishing, and we would cruise about a little, after which I would put him aboard his canoe again. I asked him to tell all the other boats not to mention that we had arrived, as we had an important matter on hand and didn't want people to know where we were. Anything that smacked of the underhand was right down his street, and he shouted out the necessary instructions to the other boats, the crews of which grinned and nodded agreement. I said that we would meet them again as they returned in the evening, and put Shilingi back in his boat. I added that I should be donating a case of English beer to be shared amongst them, at which there were shouts of "Mazuri sana," very good indeed, and I was pretty sure that they would keep their mouths shut if only for the sake of the promised beer. They sailed off, and we headed out to sea. Shilingi was greatly taken with John's height, and kept on looking at him, and remarking that he was undoubtedly a great fighter. When we were well out, we all settled down in the cockpit, and I got down to business. I asked Shilingi whether it would be possible for me to go ashore, or whether there was a camp of soldiers near him. He said that there was indeed a camp, but that it was just round the point. This was good news, being round the point I mean, as it meant that in all probability we had not been spotted. As to going ashore, that would be easy. All we had to do was to transfer me to his canoe, and he would land me. John could anchor out at night, and would not be seen, and I could be run out in the canoe in the morning, and be put aboard again. It was as simple as that. But he remarked, "I shall have to hide you in my hut, as all strangers are arrested if they go near the camp, or some are shot if they are walking about near where the Chinamen have another camp, so that we never go out of the village, except the women, to till the land round about. You, being a white man, would undoubtedly be shot if you were seen." This was cheerful news indeed. I asked him how it came about that he was not allowed to wander about in his own island. Here is his story as he told it to me. I have set it down in his own words, as nearly as possible. You remember, Bwana, when you and I went to Zanzibar port, and I promised you that there would be some great events. Well, I did not lie, did I? There were great things that happened then. There was a great killing of Arabs, and that was very good, for they had taken all the land from us, and had all the shops and big houses, did not pay us much money when we worked for them, and treated us very badly. Was I not a slave to Arabs, and often beaten and chained by them? You know that that is so that when I learned from my brothers that we were going to kill them and take their shops and houses, I was very pleased, although I thought that there would be a great fight, but there was not, as you know, for you were there and saw what happened. I did not get a gun myself, because no one had taught me how to use one, so I did not kill anybody, but I saw many killed, and I went into their houses and took anything I wanted. Soon I had more than I could carry, but I met a friend who had been a taxi driver in Kenya, and he knew how to drive a car. So when we came to a house, which had a car in front, we took this car and then loaded it up with things from houses and shops, and then we drove it down to my village and put all the things in my hut. Then we went back to the town and collected a lot of other things. This we did many times, so that now my friend and I are partners in a shop, which we have built in my village. Also, he took a young Arab girl for a wife, but she is now dead. Also, the motor car died and sits outside my hut, but we are selling spare parts from it. I do not remember how many days passed, but then we were told that we now had a new government, and everyone must do what the government told them to do, and no more Arabs were to be killed or things taken from shops, but everyone must go back to their homes and work hard and not say things against the government. This we all did, and everyone was very pleased with the government, for we thought that now there would be no more taxes, and everyone could do what they liked. And many young men who had guns became askaris, and those who were not askaris were ordered to give their guns to the government, and no one was allowed to have a gun, and many who did not give their guns back were beaten and sent to prison. Then men came round, saying that we had to give 100 shillings for a tax, and this was to buy uniforms for the new askaris. And then ships came from Russia and also from China, and they gave a lot of guns and motor cars to the government, and the Russians now teach the askaris how to use these guns, for they are to fight the Portuguese. Now, many people are saying that things are very bad, because these foreigners give orders to our politicians, and the politicians are frightened of them, and do what they say. Also they have camps with barbed wire round them, and no one is allowed to go near and see what is inside. But I do not trouble about these things, for I have taken a new wife 3 days ago, and I have a shop and a boat. We pulled his leg about taking a new wife at his age. He already had 2 to my knowledge, but as he reasonably pointed out, when a man began to get old, he started to lose his powers, and a new young wife stimulated matters. He surprised us by saying that she was from the Congo, and when we asked how she arrived down here, he told us that many refugees from the Congo had crossed the lake and come into Tanganyika, where they had been accommodated in camps. Her father had money and had been a shopkeeper, and had soon left the camp and come to the coast at Zanzibar, where he now had a shop. He was apparently an astute businessman, because Shilingi had had to pay him 400 shillings for his daughter's hand. He asked us where we were sailing to, and when I told him we were only keeping out of the way till the evening, he laughed and said that there was no need to do that, because there were now several boats with two masts like ours, and the Chinese were not sailors, and would not know that we were white men. In any case, if they saw us fishing, they would not trouble to look twice, as one boat was like another to them, as long as we did not anchor close inshore, so that it could be seen that white men were aboard. That would be all right, and even if we were seen, we would be taken for Russians. He said that it would be best if we put about and put him off in his canoe again, as he wanted to talk to the crews of the other canoes, and tell them not to mention even to their wives what was afoot. Otherwise it would be all over the place. Well, you have to take some risks, and as he seemed to know what he was talking about, we decided to fall in with his idea. So we again headed for land, and when we were a few miles off, at Ch13's suggestion, we cut the engine and set the mainsail only. As he rightly said, when a good way off the coast, a ship with one sail looks like any other ship with one sail, if you are not a sailor. As we closed the little fleet, Ch13's boat came out to meet us, and the transfer took place. He had agreed to come out in his boat at dusk that evening and take me off, adding that we should both show lights, so that we should not miss each other. I was a bit dubious about this, but he said that it was quite usual at this season of the year for boats to fish at night. So we parted for the time being, Ch13 not forgetting to ask for the case of English beer, which was duly handed over. For the second time we headed out to sea, and as Foggen said, in Oliver, reviewed the situation. This was one of our favorite records, and we generally bawled out the world in a very satisfying manner. John was a bit worried as to whether we could wholly trust Ch13 not to blab all over the place, or even arrange a nice little reception party of Ascaris for me. But although Ch13 was undoubtedly a good bit of a scoundrel, he was a likable one, and I was pretty sure that he would not let me down, as he seemed to regard me as a friend. I thought that he scented a plot, or skullduggery, of some kind, and that would appeal to his nature, especially as there might be some pickings for him. In any case, we were committed now, and had to see the thing through. I admit to some private qualms, not liking the news about people getting shot if they wandered too near a camp, and from what Ch13 said, these appeared to be uncomfortably near his village, but I kept quiet about my anxiety. When the coastline was just a blur, we set the mizzen and jib and headed south. We had all day to waste, and the only thing to do was to tack about and make sure that we made our landfall at the right time. I put out a line, and after a while landed a nice sea salmon, which we had for lunch, and we frittered the time away doing a bit of washing, and make and mend generally. Mostly at sea I don't mind in the least lazing the time away, but today the time seemed to drag endlessly, and I was constantly looking at my watch, and being surprised that time was going so slowly. I gave Buller a bath in fresh water, a thing he hates, but if he is not bathed regularly, the salt spray gives him an irritation. a sort of rash of small pimples, which of course he scratches and makes sore. At long last, we reckoned that it was time to head shorewards. Again, if we were to meet Shilingi just after dark, as arranged, we had timed it well, and about at 7, when it was quite dark, we spotted the lights of not one but several fishing boats coming offshore. This caused us a bit of consternation, and John, who was at the helm, luffed her up into the wind, whilst we held a council of war. We were not, of course, sure that they were fishing boats. We could only see their lights, but as these seemed to be the usual paraffin affairs, they were probably our friends. We could not understand why, if they were Shilingi and company, there were so many of them, as we had expected only him to come out. We hung about where we were, quite prepared to beat it in a hurry if anything queer was going on, but after a while they all spread out in the usual manner, except one which continued on her course, heading for us. We were very relieved to hear Shilingi's voice as soon as the boat was within hailing distance, and in a few minutes more he came aboard. He explained that the fishing that day had been very poor, and that it had been decided to fish at night, as at this time of the year fishing was often better during the dark hours, and the fish were attracted by the lights. Now he said it would be a good thing if I was to get into his boat at once, and he would take me ashore, as there was a man coming who he wanted me to meet. I wondered whether it was the man who wanted to meet me, and suspected that Shilingi had talked a bit, who would be able to tell me everything that was going on in Zanzibar. John could easily hang about with the fishing boats, and he, Shilingi, would ferry me out in the morning. I didn't much like the idea of my arrival being expected, as I had no doubt it now was, but barring throwing up the whole idea, there was nothing I could do about it. John was like an old hen, insisting that I take his 3/8, and Buller was nearly as bad. He did all he could to get into the canoe with me, and only the fact that he was wearing his harness prevented him. At the last moment I decided to take the small Leica camera with me, in case I could manage a shot at one of the camps, or anything else of interest. Actually, I did not expect to be able to take anything, as I hoped to be off and away by dawn. There was not much wind. As usual, it had dropped at dark, and it was all of an hour before we grounded on the sands. Once there, Shilingi lost no time in hurrying me up to his hut. As usual, I had that giddy feeling I always have when I first go ashore, as if the ground was heaving about. There seemed to be some kind of a preparation going on for a feast, and Shilingi confirmed this, explaining that no Chinese ever came near the village when there was a dance or a feast. The only time they had put in an appearance, some of the young men had been a bit tight and had started to fight the Chinks. Since then, when they heard the drums, they had kept discreetly out of the way. I gave him full marks. The last thing I wanted were a few Chinks wandering about in the vicinity. He reminded me of the last time I had spent the night in his village, and bemoaned the fact that this time there were no tins of European meat. Still, he remarked cheerfully, the case of beer was here in the hut, and he and I could polish it off between us. The other people could drink palm toddy. There was much bustling about outside the hut, as the women and girls got the food and drink ready for the evening's fun. I sat in the door of the hut, and most of them called out greetings to me as they passed, pulling my leg about my state of bachelorhood, and suggesting that there were plenty of nice young girls here in the village to cheer me up in the night hours. They all remembered me, and the nice dance we had all enjoyed on the last occasion. I was a bit jittery, lest news of my arrival had reached the wrong ears, and would have sat inside the hut had it not been filled with smoke and the effluvia of chickens and goats. Smoke never seems to bother Africans, but most Europeans cannot stand it very long, and after a few minutes find that their eyes sting in a painful manner. The assorted smells are not to be relished either. I remarked to Ch13 that I hoped on this occasion the Chinese would run true to form, and not start snooping round. He greatly reassured me by telling me that he had posted small boys, who were not allowed at the dance anyway, on all the footpaths leading to the village, with instructions to rush back and give warning of any strangers approaching. I suppose that it was about 9 o'clock when the feasting and dancing started, and drums, as usual, announcing the start of festivities. I asked where the new wife was, but was told that she would not come out to her hut until the morrow. To do so would be very unlucky. In fact, I had committed a small social faux pas by even mentioning her. I was given about 4 pounds of baked fish, served on palm leaf, and I intimated that this, plus a couple of bottles of beer, would suffice me. I am never too keen on eating food cooked by Africans. With all the good will in the world, they are not very particular about the odd bit of dirt getting into the stew, and the children are allowed to dive their hands in whilst it's cooking and pinch a few tasty morsels, and hands serve as handkerchiefs generally. I was about a quarter of the way through my fish when a tall figure walked rapidly past me into the hut. Ch13 jumped up and said that this was his friend, whom we were expecting. I followed him inside, and in the dim light I saw a typical Zanzibari, lightish-colored, with a beaded hat, and dressed in a white shirt and gray flannel bags. Not many of the educated ones wore the long flowing robes of their fathers. Introductions were quickly over. It appeared that he was a member of Parliament, and of course I was suitably impressed, and quickly offered him a bottle of English beer. He talked very rapidly to Ch13 in very high-class Swahili, and I could not follow it at all, but gathered that he was asking what sort of chap I was, and was I to be trusted. Ch13 evidently assured him that I was, for turning to me, he said in extremely good English, "I should like to know why you have come secretly to Zanzibar. I am a friend of the English, although I was one who fought for our independence. Have you come as a friend or as an enemy of my people?" This was a bit of a poser. I had not expected such a direct question, and was at a loss to answer for a moment. He noticed my hesitation and went on. "Ch13 has told me you are a good man, which is why I have come here to see you. I know that you were refused permission to land, but nevertheless you have come to this village. You must have a reason for wishing to come here. What is this reason?" I had thought pretty fast whilst he was talking, and decided to tell him the truth, or part of it at any rate. "You must understand that I have lived nearly all my life in foreign countries away from England, and as you say, I have a reason for coming here. There are some people in Kenya, yes, and in Uganda, who have heard that there are now many Russians and Chinese in Zanzibar these days, and that the young men of Zanzibar are being trained with weapons supplied by these people. Now they say, 'Who are these Zanzibaris wanting to fight?' We know that Zanzibar has joined Tanganyika, and we wonder whether they will try and make us join them also. We used to want all three countries to be one, but now that the Chinese and Russians are there in great numbers, we are frightened that they may come to our countries also. As Ch13 has doubtless told you, I have lived so long in Africa that I am a friend of the African people. Some of these people said that as I was sailing about in my boat, could I not land in Zanzibar and find out if all these rumors were true. I assure you that I wish no harm at all to your country." He thought this over for a minute or two, and finally said, "Let us have some food and talk of other things, whilst I think about what you have told me." We sat and ate, and drank a couple of bottles of beer each, talking about crops, fishing, trade, unemployment, and other topics of the day. The dance was warming up, as the palm toddy contributed its quota to the fun, and the din of the drums and xylophones was pretty terrific. Had to almost shout to make ourselves heard. After I had handed round cigarettes, our guest suddenly said, "Yes, I will tell you what you want to know, and you must tell your friends what I have told you." I refrain from mentioning his name, as he had asked me not to. He explained that he was not in favor with the powers that be, and if they found out that he had talked to a foreigner, he would be in worse trouble. His story was as follows. When they saw other colonies getting independence, and the millions of pounds that at once started pouring in from Britain and America, they thought that it would be a marvelous thing to get rid of the Sultan and his government, and become an independent country under African rule. So some of the more educated and influential Africans formed an underground party within the official opposition. It was planned to merely take over key points, such as the armory, wireless, port, airfield, and so on. It was important to take the armory because they had no arms, although one man, Babu, promised that immediately they had seized power, he had friends in China who would immediately supply them with arms. This man, Babu, stressed that any country must have an army and modern arms. Also there were certain sections of the Tanganyikans who would give aid. In fact, they did send over Ascaris to help. It had never been visualized that there would be any bloodshed, at least not by him and his particular cronies. However, the young men got out of hand, and encouraged by Babu and our old friend Okello, started on the systematic slaughter of the Arab population. He stressed that there must have been a shipment of arms from either China or Russia landed previously, of which he and his friends knew nothing, because there were simply not enough arms in the armory to supply all the young men who eventually were armed. When things eventually quietened down, a government was formed of which he was a member, but he found, to his dismay, that all the old guard were now definitely in a minority, Babu and a few friends having gained power, assisted by Russians and Chinese, who by now were pouring into the island in various guises, as instructors, technicians, etc. The foreigners were now the power behind the throne. He and his friends had jumped out of the frying pan into the fire. All decisions were now made by a few top men. The people were not being consulted. Shipments of arms were now constantly coming in. At first, these were shipped across to Tanganyika, where they were passed on to the Congo rebels. Now, however, the arms remained in Zanzibar, where the government were arming troops. He said about 300 a month, though he was not sure of the exact figure, who was being trained by both Russians and Chinese in their use. In reply to my question, he said that these troops were not kept on the island, but as soon as their training was finished, they were sent off to Tanganyika, not via Dar es Salaam, as had commonly been supposed, but via Bagamoyo, and thence into southern districts bordering on the Mozambique country, where they were engaged in raids into Portuguese territory. I gathered that there was some sort of master plan whereby all East Africa would in time come under communist domination, either the Russian or Chinese variety, but he was vague about concrete details. The Portuguese colonies were also to be overrun, and eventually South Africa. Now he finished up, nothing had gone according to the original plan. Zanzibar was certainly not freed from foreign domination. In fact, things were much worse than under the Sultan. He dare not protest at the way things were going, otherwise he would soon find himself quietly being disposed of. There were two things he would like me to do. One was to deliver a letter to a certain African in Kenya, and the other was to hand over a small steel box to another person, this time an Arab, in Mombasa. I promised to do both. After another bottle of beer, he left, saying that it would not do for him to be out late in that part of the island. He had given me much more to think about, and incidentally saved me a lot of snooping about. I did not doubt he had been telling me the truth, was patently worried and sincere. I did not have too much sympathy for him and his friends. They had made their beds, and must lie on them. They were not the first to seek power, and find themselves edged out of it. So they were landing at Bagamoyo, shades of Stanley. It was from this small town, once the end of the slave caravans, from which he had set out to find Livingstone. A town with a history of misery. It was impossible to sleep, and I spent the rest of the night making a few notes on a cheap writing pad and occasionally watching the dancing. I knew it would go on till dawn, when I hoped that the fishing fleet would arrive back and I could get away from this sinister island that had such a fair face and such a black heart and such a history of cruelty. I vowed that I would never have anything to do with politics again, even unofficially observing. Once I had carried out my part of the bargain and made my report, I would be off on the clean, fresh sea with old John and Buller. I asked Ch13 what he thought of the events, and what he hoped for in the future. He laughed and said that he now had a shop and a motor car. He was making money, so it didn't worry him who were the bosses, and who fought whom. A typical African attitude. There had been a slight offshore wind during the night, and towards dawn it freshened considerably. Ch13 opined that if this wind did not drop, the fishing boats would be late in. This was the last thing I wanted, but there was nothing to be done about it. Far from freshening, I wanted it to drop, but instead it continued to increase. Once I was aboard a hooroo again, it could blow as hard as it liked. In fact, the harder the better. As dawn broke, it was still very fresh, and I walked down to the beach in the hope of catching a glimpse of the boats returning, but there was not a sail to be seen. Of course, with the wind against them, they would probably take in their sails and resort to their paddles, and a small canoe a few miles out, with a fair swell running, is not an easy thing to spot. I could only wait. As soon as it was really light, I suggested to Ch13 that it might be a good idea if I sneaked through the plantations and tried to get a photo of the camp, but he begged me not to, saying that if I was seen and caught, he would get into trouble for not immediately reporting the presence of a white man. He said that if I wanted to take a picture, he would like me to take one of his latest wife, and also his motor car. I agreed to this, promising to send him copies, and he went to the girl's hut and fetched her out. I must say that she was an eyeful. She had greased herself all over, and shone like a beacon. Giggling, and after much trouble, she was persuaded to sit on the bumper bar of the car, and I managed to snap her. I am afraid that I cheated a bit, as I was more interested in taking her than the car. I hope they like the enlargement I sent them. At about 8 o'clock, a small boy dashed up and said that 4 men were walking along the beach, coming in this direction. I didn't like this at all, but Ch13 rushed me into the new bride's hut, saying that no one would think of entering it. They might, he said, be coming to see him about getting fish. Apparently he, or rather his village, supplied some to the camp. But it turned out to be a false alarm, as they continued their walk and did not enter the village. However, it reminded me to be careful, as had they come along when I was taking the picture, I must have been spotted. At 10 o'clock or so, the fleet was reported to be coming in, and no one was more relieved than I. After a quick scout round, Ch13 was satisfied that no strangers were about, and he and 3 of his crew went and shoved his canoe into the water. As soon as it was afloat, I ran down and got in, and we went out to meet them. I could just discern a hooroo on the horizon, hull down, but coming in. I don't know how long it actually was, but it seemed to me to be hours before we bumped gently against the good old familiar hull of a hooroo, and heard John say, "Sorry I could not pipe you aboard, Admiral," and Buller's welcoming bark and excited whining from the cabin. I went below and got out a case of beer, 1 bottle of whiskey, and a couple of 100 shillings, as a present for Ch13. I stressed that the crew were to get a fair share of the beer, and was rewarded by delighted grins. Just before they cast off, Ch13 shouted that he wanted a picture of his boat, but I told him I had already taken one on my previous visit, and would send him a copy. Farewells over, we lost no time in heading out to sea. I still had visions of someone putting out after us, and wanted to put as much sea between me and Zanzibar as possible. Naturally, as soon as we were well away, I had to report everything to John. He agreed that I could not have done more than I had, which rather eased my conscience, as all that I had to report was really hearsay. I had not seen the camps myself, neither had I seen any signs of men being trained, but the pattern seemed to be correct. Then it was John's turn, and he told me that early in the morning the wind had got up, and the canoes had had quite a bit of trouble holding their own. He had contemplated coming in on his own, and had decided to give it till midday before doing so. He knew I would be worrying a bit, but fortunately the wind had dropped, and they had been able to make it. I was as hungry as hell, and went below and cooked myself a terrific meal, which I regret to own I washed down with several cups of rum and coffee. The rum must have been well up to strength, because John remarked that I came into the cockpit smelling highly of trifle. We now had to decide which course to set for Mombasa. We had 2 open to us. Either we could turn northeast and then sail up the coast of Kenya, or sail due north, which course would take us well out to sea, and then turn east for Mombasa, which would be 2 sides of a square, and a longer mileage. However, we should have a following wind, most of the way on the longer leg, and also be away from prying eyes. We decided to head north. The morning came when John woke me with a cry of "Land ho!" and I tumbled out on deck to see the long, low coast of Africa again. We were heading directly into the port of Mombasa. Astern of us, a large freighter was coming up, and would no doubt be docked long before we moored, as we were only making 3 knots. However, we were in no hurry, and reckoned that we should be in by noon. The swell had of course gone, and we were in the usual choppy seas, which is not very comfortable sailing, and makes cooking a nightmare. However, as it was not my turn to cook breakfast, this did not worry me, at least not until John served up tinned herrings, biscuits, and coffee left over in the previous night's thermos. A couple of miles out, we switched over to engine, as it is quite a tricky channel if you are under sail, with not much room for error. I had rented a buoy right at the far end of the port, and at exactly noon we made fast to it, another trip over. We had not been bothered with any formalities. One of the pilot boats had seen and waved to us as we were entering the harbor, but it was a Cap we knew, and he probably thought we had just been out for a day or so, as we had been before. There is always a flat sort of feeling when returning from a voyage, but we cheered ourselves up with a few drinks, and a good lunch at the club. It would not be long before we were off again, this time with nothing to do except enjoy ourselves. After lunch, I went round to the office of the organization and made a full report. It seems we had done well, and supplied the information that was wanted. I do not know or care to what use this information was put. However, I got a very generous check, on the strength of which we chucked a large party of sorts at my favorite pub, the Star Bar. And now we are preparing to explore the Sea of Zanj, visiting all those small islands which you don't see on school atlases. I doubt if we will see rocks carrying off elephants, or serpents that swallow them whole, but who knows? We might find the last of the dodos, or the wreck of an East Indian, full of chests of silver coins, bars of gold, and many costly jewels, or even the ghost of Sinbad.